So I'm going to be talking about higher education funding and access for the next 40 minutes or so. So traditionally this is an area that IFS have done a lot of work in, particularly for the last 10 years or so. And we were heavily involved in various policy responses over that period, in particular in the last year, heavily involved in the election, responding to Labour's announcement of a 6k fee proposal, and various other fiscal events. Obviously this is an area that generates quite a lot of interest in the media and more broadly. For example, the sort of mass protests that we've seen across London on numerous occasions. These are from the 2012, the proposed 2012 reforms, but there have been examples of this sort of thing going on several occasions in the last few years. But I think before going into the detail of the 2012 reforms themselves, it's important to talk about the reasons for state intervention in the sector in the first place, considering what exactly the government is trying to achieve, and have a think about sort of how far the government should be intervening in this area. So I'm going to start this lecture by going through this, i.e. the reasons why the government would want to intervene at all into the sector. I'm then going to look more specifically at the 2012 reforms, having gone through a sort of broad overview of how higher education is funded in England. I'm going to look specifically at the impact of the 2012 reforms on university funding, cash in pockets for students, the impact on graduates and specifically their long-run repayments, and of course the public finances, which is something we comment on quite frequently. After that, I'm going to talk about access to higher education for those from poor backgrounds, and talk about the evidence is a little bit weak, but I'm going to talk about what the impact of the 2012 reforms seems to have been on access to higher education. And then I'm going to talk about what sort of the future holds in this area. So what has happened more recently and what we think is potentially going to happen over the next period. So first of all, why should the government intervene in the sector at all? What's the rationale for the government not just staying out of this market and letting the market provide its own solutions? Well, there are four reasons why we might get inefficient outcomes if that were the case. I'm going to address each of these in turn, but as I'm going through them, it's important to think about not only if the government is going to intervene in this area, what is the correct level of intervention for the government. So the first of these four things is externalities. So obviously education may create benefits to society over and above the benefits to the individual, i.e. the total return to an individual being at higher education will exceed their own private returns. Of those private returns, we know they are large. For example, this rather dated paper from Blundell et al. In 2000 found that the causal impact of going to university was a 17% wage premium for men and a 37% wage premium for women. More recently, my stuff, this is not causal, this is very descriptive, but has shown that graduates earn a lot more than non-graduates. It's around 2 times as much for men and about 3 times as much for women, using kind of very rich administrative data. This is. So we know there are big private wage returns, but there are also, of course, high social returns. So a better educated workforce might result in higher employment and earnings, which is results in more tax revenue and less spending on benefits. So that's kind of a direct pecuniary long-run benefit to the government. But then there's also sort of more indirect things such as productivity spillover effects, human capital spillover, and then a sort of more general, better health amongst the population, lower crime, and sort of a more politically engaged, well-informed society. So all of these things are certainly there, if difficult to quantify. And it's important for the government to, be aware that individuals will not take into account the social return when they're making the decision whether or not to go to university. So there is definitely an advantage in encouraging people to go. But on the other hand, individuals will not take into account this, individuals with very high private returns will probably get the efficient level of education anyway. And so any kind of encouragement to those people will be could be considered a deadweight loss. So, for example, individuals with extremely high returns, so individuals who've got very high A levels going to Cambridge or LSE or King's or UCL, have very high wage returns, they'll go to university anyway, regardless, well, within a certain range. And therefore, a government-targeted subsidy at those individuals might be inefficiently used. A second, so it's clear that the government should subsidise in this area, but it's not necessarily clear to what degree. This doesn't necessarily mean that there should be free education for everybody. It merely suggests that it should subsidise in some cases. A second failure of the market, or a reason why the market might lead to inefficient solutions, is the failure of credit markets. So higher education study by students requires cash, not only for your fees, which of course we're considering a case where there's no government intervention in the sector, so the universities would charge fees to people to go. Individuals would have to find that money up front, and they'd also obviously have to cover their living expenses while they're there. With perfect credit markets, if you've got positive returns to education, lenders would come in and offer money to students to go that they pay back over the course of their lifetime at interest, and everybody would win. However, we don't have perfect credit markets for two main reasons. The first of these is a lack of collateral against which to secure debt. So if you're going to buy a house and need to get a mortgage, you go to a mortgage company and say, can I borrow this much money? And they say yes, but if you can't afford to pay us back, we'll take your house. In this case, there's not really the equivalent. So you can't offer your education to a lender if you fail to repay them. And even if you could, it wouldn't be of much value to them. A second major reason is asymmetric information. So specifically, the borrower has more information about themselves than the lender does, which exposes the lender to classic problems of adverse selection and moral hazard. So these factors lead to higher interest rates when credit is offered, or just no lending at all in some areas. You see examples of this. This may be less true in future years, but you see examples of this in the postgraduate market, where you can get loans to go privately to go to study master's degrees and the like, but the interest rate on those loans is ridiculously high. It's like I think a career development loan, certainly when I was doing a master's, was around 10% interest or something like that. Now that's just way above what the government is currently offering, for example, on classic student debt. So you really see examples of this kind of. It's either credit rationing, you can't get the loan at all, or it's ridiculously high interest rates, and that's what you might expect to happen in the undergraduate market. So the government should, to get around this problem, intervene and provide state-backed loans. But again, how cheap? There's a question of how much they should intervene. Like how cheap should these loans be? What sort of interest rates should they provide? A third reason why the government should intervene in this area is risk and uncertainty. For one thing, students are risk averse, and they might be reluctant to borrow if they have mortgage-style repayments. So these are the types of student loans that existed in the 1990s, at least on a small scale. So this is where you borrow from the government or you borrow privately, and you just have to make repayments regardless of what your income is. Now, individuals might be quite worried about doing that. If they think that the returns to education are not very high, they're really worried, for example, that they might struggle to get work at all, they might be reluctant to take on those loans. That's even if they know that there, on average, is an expected positive return. Then they also know that there's big variation in what people actually go on to earn. And so if there's some chance that they might fail the degree or fail to get a job, they may end up not being able to pay and be burdened with this debt. And so this might end up with an inefficiently low number of people going to university just because of this risk aversion aspect. So what would be nice then is if you can kind of protect people against this concern by saying, look, if you aren't able to earn very much or aren't able to get a job, we'll insert some insurance in this. So you just don't have to repay your debt if you're not earning enough money. So this is something that the market is incredibly unlikely to provide, but it's something that the government could do. But then again, we come back to this question of how much insurance should the government insert into their loans. So at the moment we see a kind of lower threshold on when you have to start making repayments in actual student loans. But there's been great debate about where that threshold should be. Should it be at sort of median earnings? Should it be very high? Should it be very low? And it's not necessarily clear what exactly that level should be set at. A fourth reason for government intervention in this sector is informational problems. So to make rational decisions, individuals should be informed about the nature of the product. They should know what the cost of going is and what the likely long-run returns are going to be. Now, I think it's a bit of a tragedy in this country that the information about what earnings you're likely to get from going to different universities is pretty sparse. This is something that I've been working on trying to address. But there's actually, so if you, for example, go on websites available that give you information about what university you should choose, such as I think Which provide one. There's also something called the Key Information Set provided by government. These tell you rough average earnings, and you often see kind of posters around saying, we have this employment rate from our students and we have this average earnings from our students. But these are based on very poor survey data. It's something called the DLHE, the Destination of Leavers of Higher Education. And that survey is not very well responded to. The questions are not particularly well set up. And the information really just isn't that clear. And so this is something that may seriously impact whether or not people make adequate decisions or the right decisions about whether or not to go to university. And so the question is, if the government was not intervening in this sector, would the market provide this information appropriately? And I think potentially not. It might not be in the interest of private lenders to encourage sort of lower return individuals to go to university, for example. There are also considerable concerns about debt aversion. Now this in general is an area that's sort of less of a sort of, okay, yeah, they should intervene, but how much? This is something that I think the government should just be providing as much information as possible. But anyway, they're the four kind of main reasons why the government should just be intervening at all. And I think that just gives a bit of a backdrop for why the system looks something like it does today. Okay, so now I'm going to go more into the detail of how it is funded, or how higher education is funded and how the system does look today. So since 1998, we've had income contingent loans where individuals can borrow to cover their cost of their degree, and they repay based on their earnings. So they only have to repay if they're earning above a certain threshold. They've also started to face tuition fees since 1998. So they're introduced, £1,000 fees were introduced that year. They were increased to £3,000 per year in 2006, and subsequently in line with inflation. And then there was this big reform in 2012 when fees were increased again to £9,000. Since then, fees have been frozen at that level in nominal terms, so they've been declining in real terms. Although that may change in the next year or so with the introduction of the teaching excellence framework. Meanwhile, teaching grants are paid directly from government to universities. So when you go to university, the government will give the university an extra grant that supports your study there. They sort of covered a much higher fraction of the cost of going to university in the old days than they do now, for obvious reasons, because fees have gone up so much. The transfer directly from government to universities has gone down with each student. So now teaching grants don't exist for anything except science and clinical and lab-based subjects. In fact, as I was saying, England is actually relatively unusual in offering financial supports to cover living costs as well as tuition fees. These come in two forms, grants and loans. So grants you don't have to pay back and loans you do. Grants were worth around £3,500, well currently are worth £3,500 per year, but are due to be scrapped and replaced with loans. So now all students will have to can borrow to cover their living costs while they're at university, but they have to repay that if they earn a sufficient amount. So more specifics into the 2012 reform, which I'm going to go into detail of the impact of. So as I said, fees are increased from around 3,300. That's because they were increasing with inflation between 06 and 11-12. They went up from 3,300 to £9,000. As before, so there was no change to the fact that you could borrow this tuition fee from the government and you can repay it back when you earn sufficiently. That actually wasn't the case until 2005. Between 1998 and 2005, you couldn't borrow your tuition fee loan, so you had to pay your tuition fee. Although it's smaller, you had to pay that up front, whereas a tuition fee loan was introduced in 2006. In addition to this, there were some small changes to grants and loans. So there was quite a lot of fanfare about how the 2012 reforms, yes, are increasing fees, but we're also increasing cash in pockets for students. There wasn't really, in practice, very much change. This is pretty small. But the thing that does matter alongside the big increase in fees is the change to the loan repayment conditions. So previously, you had to pay 9% of all of your earnings above £15,000, or £15,795, depending on which price you're using. This was increased to £21,000. So this lower threshold at which you start making repayments was increased quite considerably in 2012. And this had quite a big impact, as we'll see in a minute. In addition to this, there was an increase in the interest rate at which you face on your student loans. So if you're currently studying, so if you started university after 2012, you face a positive real interest rate while you're studying of 3%, so RPI plus 3%. In the old days, that was zero plus RPI. And then you face a positive real interest rate if you're earning above a certain level. So if you're earning below 21,000, you pay 0% plus RPI. If you're earning above 41,000, you pay 3% plus RPI, and it's linearly increasing in between. So essentially, this just means they were bringing in positive real interest rates on the debt. Yes, sorry.
Are they using RPI still?
They are still using RPI, yeah. So you could, so when I say real 0% real, that's kind of a shorthand. It's in practice, this is like 1% real. Yeah. Sorry, was that the same question? Yeah. And finally, debt was now written off after 30 years rather than 25 years. So we did some analysis of these reforms. We do this by simulating future graduate earnings using survey data and imposing some structure on the earnings dynamics. So essentially, if we're going to estimate what the impact of reforms to repayments from students is going to be, we have to simulate what those students are going to earn over their lifetime. So I have to say that this is quite a speculative exercise. We are simulating what all kind of your cohort of people will be earning over the next 30 years in order to calculate what you're going to repay. And so, by necessity, all of this stuff is quite sensitive to what assumptions we place on the model. But anyway, from this we can estimate the repayments through the life cycle. And yeah, as I say, it's a difficult exercise. We look at this, we use this model to look at the impact of the 2012 reforms for students, graduates, for universities, and the taxpayer. Obviously, for students and universities, that's less sensitive to the long-run stuff. It's the graduates and the taxpayer that's really affected by this modelling. I should also say at this point there's a lot of interest from the media in this something called the RAB charge, which is the share of all student loans that are written off. Now that's something that grabs a lot of attention, but I don't think it's a particularly interesting stat, so I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail, but I will say that I'll use it as an illustrative example of just how sensitive these numbers are to our assumptions. Okay, and another kind of key thing that we were able to do is investigate not only sort of average changes, so not only the average effect on graduates, we can also break it down and look through the distribution of graduates to see how it affects poorer and richer graduates differently. So this table summarises our overall estimates of the impact of the 2012 reform. So the left-hand column is the pre-2012 system. This is holding everything else constant. It's just the funding system that's changing. And the right-hand column, or the middle column, is the 2012 system. So the first thing to note is, starting from the bottom, is that student funding didn't really change very much, as I've said already. Big fanfare about changes to student allowances. In practice, there wasn't really much going on. This is how much cash students had in their pockets on average through the course of their degree. So this is grants plus loans. There's not really much going on there. The second thing is the impact on universities. We see a big increase in university funding of 30%, and now I think this is often kind of forgotten in the analysis of these reforms. You know, a lot of people focus on sort of the impact on the taxpayer or the impact on graduates, but the truth is universities saw a 30% increase in their funding during a period when pretty much all other departments were being, cut to death, or for want of a better phrase. But I mean, that's quite a big deal. Universities argued strongly that they'd seen a big decline in their real funding per student over time and needed a financial boost. And this reform was able to provide that. It was able to provide that by not by dramatically increasing the taxpayer contribution, but instead by increasing the burden on students quite significantly. So we see that graduates are now having to make around a £23,000 average contribution in net present value towards their degree. The taxpayer in this is roughly even. So they've cut their teaching grants, they increase loans, more of the loans are written off, and so the net balance of all that is roughly the same. So I'm going to talk now about these graduate repayments in slightly more detail. So this gives, we're still sort of talking on the averages here. This gives the average schedule of repayments under the 2011 system and the 2012 system. And we see lower average repayments from graduates in the first sort of 10 years. This is entirely because of the change in the threshold at which individuals started making repayments. So under the old system, the threshold was at around £15,500. That was boosted up to £21,000. So if you're earning £21,000 under the new system, you pay nothing. Under the old system, you'd have paid 9% of £5,000 or so. But however, after that 10-year period, these repayments start to decline. That's because your higher earners are clearing their debt by this stage. So this is just the average across all graduates. Higher earners are starting to clear their debt, so their repayments are going away. And so you see this decline, and then everything's written off after 25 years. The new system, it takes much longer for people to start clearing their debt, and then the decline. So the decline happens later, and you see this huge difference. So this is all increased average repayments to the taxpayer, and then of course the debts are written off after 30 years instead of 25. So that's the overall picture, but this gives the picture broken down by graduates. So here we've divided them up into 10 bins. So the 10th bin is the richest graduates. So these are the people, we've added up everybody's lifetime earnings. So these are the people who earn the most over the course of their lifetime. And these, of course, are the poorest. So the key observation here is that, in fact, the lowest 30% of graduates were better off from the reforms. I.e. the expected present, or the present value of their expected repayments is lower under the new system than under the old. And that makes sense if you think of a person who's going to earn $20,000 all of their life. Under the old system, they would have made repayments. Under the new, they wouldn't make any. And so that's entirely driven by the increase in the lower threshold at which you start making repayments. However, you see, a second key observation is not only are these guys better off, but these guys are considerably worse off. The repayments of the people in the top top 30, 40% are nearly doubled on average, which is, so the net effect, the overall effect of this is for a much, much more progressive system of repayments. And a similar story, we have the share of people with some debt written off. This is not people with all of their debt written off, but under the old system you have the very poorest people, everybody has their debt written off. Whereas, around 30% or so are clearing their debt entirely. So around, under the new system, I think 73% of people under the new system will have some debt written off at the end of the period. And under the old system, around that equivalent figure is around 32%. So way more people having some debt written off at the end of the period. And that's obviously just because that's entirely because the average debt is much higher under the new system than under the old. I just want to return back to this figure here. So I said previously that the taxpayer contribution was about the same under the new system compared to the old. I also want to just draw attention to this RAB charge thing. So I said that I don't really like this RAB charge, but I'm just using it here as an illustrative example. And so here it's around 43%. So we estimate this RAB charge of 43%. So to remind you, that's the share of all student loans that are written off. That's our estimate of the share that's written off. And so, as I said, all of this is quite sensitive to our assumptions. So one of our assumptions is what is going to happen to average earnings of graduates over the next 30 years. So we have dynamics and we simulate individual earning profiles, but we need some kind of assumption about, on average, what's going to happen to be able to pin our model to something. So we make an assumption that, on average, in the long run, graduates' earnings are going to increase by 1.1% in real terms every year. This is an assumption taken from the OBR, so it's not something we have anything to do with the creation of. This results in a RAB charge of 43%. However, if we tweak this assumption to 3%, or if we drop it down to -1%, we see big changes in the overall estimate of the share of student loans that are written off. And you see the same thing, so the subsidy from government to students is very sensitive to this assumption. Again, another kind of slightly more complicated point, but just trying to get across this variation or this sensitivity to our assumptions. We also make an assumption about the discount rate. So this is the rate at which you discount future repayments. So this is using 2.2% real, which is what was always used until very recently, and they've just changed it in November, so they've brought it down. You see what a huge impact this discount rate has on our estimates of the RAB charge. So dropping it to 1.1% from 2.2 brings that average RAB charge down to 30%. So around a third of all student debt is written off. Whereas if we increase it to 3.5%, which is in line with how lots of other government calculations are done, this brings up this RAB charge to 55%. And so this is just another kind of parameter that we insert in our model as an assumption. And the point of all this is just to say, these numbers are quite sensitive to our assumptions, right? And I just wanted to get that across because I want to say, yes, this number is basically the same on average, but the key point is the taxpayer is now way more, this number is way more sensitive. This number is way more uncertain than it was under this system. That's because such a large share of this system is made up of grants, which that's a certain cost. It's £12,000. Here, grants are way smaller share. Much more of this is now just graduate repayments, which are uncertain, sensitive to assumptions. And so the government is exposed itself to way more risk under this system. Okay. So that's just an overall summary of the kind of our analysis of the 2012 reforms. And now I'm going to talk about the implication of the 2012 reforms for access to university. So obviously this is an important issue. This is are people from poor backgrounds getting into university, and more importantly, are they getting into good universities? So first of all, we know that the gap between the gap in participation is big. We know that. So here, what we've done is divided everybody up into 5 groups, and sort of give them a social economic status ranking. So this kind of continuous number that we divide into 5 bins. And we look at the participation rates. So green is participation at any university, blue is participation at high status institutions. And we see that amongst the poorest, only 20% are going, or 19% are going to any institution, and only 3% are going to the top or the high status places. Whereas amongst the richest, 61% are going, and 30%-ish are going to high status institutions. So this results in a big gap in participation between the rich and the poor. So that's just something that exists. All right, it's not indicative of a corrupt system necessarily, but it's a fact. This is from 2011, by the way, rather than a very up-to-date figure. But this is pre-reform. And so there's a lot of interest in what happened to this gap after the 2012 reforms, with many people arguing that it would put poorer people off from going to university. Now, this isn't the hardest or the greatest evidence you're ever going to see, but this figure shows the applications to UCAS from 18-year-olds. This is applications from the poorest quintile, so the poorest 20%. This is applications from the richest 20%. And this yellow bars show the gap between the two. So these are on different scales. Essentially, this is just showing that in 2012 the gap declined, in 2013 it declined again, in 2014 it declined again. And so the gap is smaller than it's ever been, and declined significantly after the 2012 reform. I'm not saying that's a causal impact to the 2012 reform, but that's just that's an observation that has been made, and many have sort of taken from that the 2012 reform had very little impact on participation. Now, I think evidence on this is pretty bad, actually, and would draw attention to a couple of things. So first, we know that performance at school is an extremely important determinant of whether or not you're able to go to university. Now, what this figure shows is, okay, this is free school meal versus non-free school meal, and this is the gap, again, on a different scale. But this shows that the gap in the share of individuals getting 5A star to C grades at GCSE declined considerably over the period leading up to this. And so maybe we would have seen a big drop in the gap anyway, in absence of the reform. We don't know what the counterfactual is. And again, and this is slightly less clear, but it's an important thing to talk about. There's been big changes in participation at university amongst different ethnic groups, and there's been big changes in composition of pupils over the last 10 years. And I just wanted to draw attention to this because I think this is just a really cool stat. This shows by ethnic group, so this is the participation of the poorest and the richest, moving from left to right, for each ethnic group. And you see here that the richest white kids are now less likely to go to university than the poorest Chinese kids. And pretty close for Indian. I mean, that's a pretty remarkable stat, and that's something that's just wasn't true 10 years ago. And I think, I don't have much of a solid theory on this, but this is all part of an important part of the puzzle, for what's going on here. Why is there this thing going on? And maybe there's some sort of more complicated immigration story that is not really being very well told. Okay, so the gap in participation enlarged, but it doesn't seem to have increased the result of the reform. If anything, it's declined. However, there's various other things going on. So I think the evidence is a bit weak, is the point of all this. In any case, this is all just looking at 18 and 19-year-old undergraduates. If you start to look elsewhere, for example, at part-time participation, I'm just going to flick through these quickly, part-time participation or mature students, you see great falls in the number of students participating. So, while looking at full-time undergraduates is one thing, if you look more deeply, there are big impacts of the reform elsewhere. Okay, so what does the future hold for higher education policy? So, first thing is the removal of the cap in student numbers. So from this year, from October in this year, there was a removal of the cap in the total number of students that could go to university in England. The government predicted this would result in 60,000 more students. We're not exactly sure what the final number is yet, but this, in theory, could have a big impact on the total cost, or a fairly big impact on the total cost of providing higher education by the government. Had the question immediately when they said, okay, we're going to remove the cap is, how is this going to be paid for? Because if you think that these extra 60,000 students look more like the sort of these guys than these guys, which you might have reason to believe. So when you have a cap on the total number of students, lots of people want to go, but some can't go. When you remove that cap, more can go. You might think that those who couldn't go, who now can, are likely to go on to perhaps earn less rather than earn more, right? And so, if they're all looking like these guys, this is going to end up being quite expensive to government. And this shows. This figure shows that this could be quite expensive. There have also been several other changes to the higher education funding system announced. So maintenance grants have been scrapped for 2016-17. So this is sort of non-loan cash that's paid to students from poorer backgrounds to attend university. Poorer students will now, they get slightly more than they would have got anyway, but that's all in the form of a loan rather than in the form of a grant. So now the poorest students will graduate with the highest debts. And of course they'll have to pay back more than they would do under the old system on average. Sorry. Okay, and whether the government will actually save money in the long run on this is questionable. If our estimates suggested that the long run impact for government was pretty minor, that's because quite a big fraction of this extra money that's being lent rather than given as grants is not going to be repaid. A very large fraction. If all of that was not repaid, then it would be exactly the same long run cost. Okay, and then so. What else is coming? So the threshold at which loan repayments, individuals start making repayments. So this was the thing that was increased to 21,000. So it was originally 15,000. It went up to 21,000. So individuals now pay 9% of all income but 21,000. That's been announced that it will be frozen from 2016. And so anybody who went to university in 2012 onwards will be impacted in quite a large way from that reform. So it's frozen for 5 years, meaning it would have gone up with real earnings growth in that intermediate period between 2016 and 2021. Instead, it's just going to be frozen, and so from now on, you will always, so that it will never catch up with where it would have been anyway. So if you think it's going up like this, it now waits and then goes up like this in a parallel line. It never catches up, and so everybody going to university from 2012 will be impacted by that for every year. And so, but that does save quite a lot of money to the government in the long run. They've also announced that they're going to be bringing in this teaching excellence framework and tying tuition fees to that teaching excellence framework. So universities that show excellent teaching are able to now, will in theory now be able to increase their fees with inflation, and so we will now start to see some fee differentiation from universities from 2017 onwards. So fees have been frozen at £9,000 a year since 2012. From 2017, they're going to start going up with inflation, but not everywhere. And that the amount that it can go up will be linked to how good teaching provision is. I mean, I think this is actually quite a monumental change. This is the first time that fees have ever been linked to anything like this. And this really, in theory, incentivizes universities to increase the quality of their teaching. And so this could really have a large impact. Another thing that's discussed, well, has been announced, and in fact this is even wrong. This discount rate that I talked about earlier, I said that all of the government long-run calculations are really sensitive to this discount rate. i.e., if you discount future repayments by more, the effective long-run cost to the taxpayer is less, because you're just effectively discounting future repayments made by students. They've now said they're going to drop this to 0.7%, which is a big drop, which will have a huge impact in the estimated long-run cost to government, just in terms of accounting, not in any actual. It doesn't affect the repayments at all. It's just how you account for them today. And so this might actually completely change the scenery. So whereas there's a lot of pressure on government to sort of reduce the long-run cost of student loans, and we saw so this freezing the threshold is an example of that pressure. That was all under this 2.2% policy, or this 2.2% discount. Now the discount rate has declined, although nothing's actually changed. The long-run estimated cost to government is way lower, and so it may well be the case that there's a lot less pressure on government to make reforms in the sector. So I wouldn't be surprised if sort of tweaks to the system that have been debated consistently over the last few years might sort of stop being so in the limelight, I think. Okay, I'm going to flip through this because I don't have time for this. Even though people would like that slide, I'm sorry. Okay, so in summary, the 2012 reforms resulted in more money for universities, higher costs, long-run costs to graduates, but lower long-run costs to the poorest, or the graduates who earn the least over their lifetimes. No big average changes to taxpayer, but a big shift in the progressivity of the distribution of repayments, but also a big increase in uncertainty. So the long-run cost to taxpayer is way less certain than it was. We also seen that the gap in participation between the rich and poor is large, but evidence, albeit weak, does not support that that poorer kids have been put off as a result of the 2012 reforms. So, yeah, as I've said, there's been further tweaks announced recently that will reduce the long-run cost to government. This is through the tuition fee, the threshold freeze, and this kind of reduction in the discount rate. Yeah, I think the current system, it should be said that the current system has some very desirable features. So loans with very reasonable interest rates are available to everybody. There's good protection against individuals not getting positive returns from university, or more specifically from low income. Individuals don't have to pay their fees. So the fees are paid up front by the government, I should say, meaning there isn't a kind of liquidity problem. So it should encourage liquidity-constrained individuals to access universities. And there's a very progressive repayment system. So the highest people who go on to benefit the most from universities repay the most, and individuals who don't earn very much, having been to university, repay the least. But it also has its flaws. So there's an implicit subsidy in all of this, in that individuals, so individuals who don't earn very much don't repay very much, and they're effectively subsidised by the government. You could argue that subsidy is kind of through the back door, i.e. you don't see it until you've sort of lived your life and realise that you didn't earn very much. Now you might argue that exactly the same valued subsidy, if well targeted at the right people, would have much more impact up front than through this backdoor system. So on the bright side, it means that you're targeting very well at the people who don't earn very much. But on the dark side, I suppose, it may have much less impact because you don't really see that, you're not really very aware of what this subsidy means. This goes back to this information problem. And you just don't see it until you've actually lived your life. An additional problem is that these reforms created very perverse incentives for universities to set high fees. And so initially it was hoped that there'd be great competition in prices, and some universities would set fees near £6,000 if they tried to attract students, and other universities would set them at £9,000, and you get a nice variation in the fees being offered, and the cost to government wouldn't be too high because of this competition. In practice, they all just set them to £9,000, and that meant that the cost to government was a lot higher than they were hoping it would be. Finally, and this isn't really in the flaws, but I'd just like to say that this teaching excellence framework really could be quite a big deal and could have quite a big impact on how universities behave. And I think that's it. Yes. Okay, are there any questions? Yeah.
How generally are international students assumed to be or analysed in higher education literature? Because, I mean, especially in the UK, because of the growing number of international students, I would imagine that has an impact on, say, the demand for funding for an institution. And moreover, like, because they pay maybe double,
Yeah.
mostly double than what UK students are paying, that
Yeah.
could just mean universities no longer demand for high grants from the central government.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it really kind of gets at an area that's very under researched. Actually, I think it's fair to say. Like, all of our analysis is just looking at English students, and
Because I imagine that changes a lot when you
yeah, I think it's likely to be much more. That's likely to be a much more pertinent issue when looking at postgraduate degrees, just because of the scale. Like, but no, you're right. It's a good question, and I essentially don't know the answer. Yeah. Yeah.
How much is the reduction in discount rate something that they've kind of justified, or is it just really filling in the numbers to try and get repayments down?
So there's a lot of very serious people who've argued that it's the right thing to do, and kind of people who aren't involved in government. So serious academics have made this case and said that it should just reflect the long-run cost of government borrowing. Now, I'm not going to say that it is a cynical move on the behalf of government, but it certainly is convenient, as far as I'd go on that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you said you only studied English students. I mean,
Yeah.
how did you separated them out from all the other home students? Because European Union students are eligible for loans.
Yeah, sure. So the analysis that we've got here is English-based student, but that is right. Yeah, it's just it was simply data limitations.
So you mean England and Wales?
Yeah. Sorry, I said English, right? But yeah, that was purely due to data limitations. I mean, if you make you can make assumptions about how EU students compare to English students, and if you assume that the distribution is the same, that it's just a scaling thing in terms of cost. I mean, all of the things I showed here were average costs anyway, so I don't think it's like that a particular issue is that severe in this case. Yeah. Sure.
How much do students currently owe, and how much will they owe in, say, 10 years?
So average debt on graduation is around mid-40s, so around £45,000, 43 to £45,000 for about 60% of students, and then for the poorer students that could increase now with the removal of the maintenance grants and replacing them with loans to around £53,000. Average debt 10 years in. I don't know the number of that on the top of my head. I mean, if you think that's an area where early on you have relatively low earnings, but you see great growth in your earnings in that period. But also you've got the interest rate accruing, so your repayments probably. So I don't know if it would change. The debt, average debt, wouldn't change that much in that period, I suppose.
But we're talking about half of the debt to all of these students being written off.
Well, I mean, so the number was 43.
Half of the debt to half of the students. But all of the debt to half of the students being written off.
No, that's not quite right. No. So the estimated cost or the estimated share of all debt to be written off is around 43% under the old assumptions, under the old system, under the 2012 system. With the threshold freeze, that comes down quite considerably. And with the change in the discount rate, the way to which you account for student future repayments, it comes down considerably to more like 20%. So I wouldn't say that half is quite the right number at the moment to take.
Because I know you had the slide, and I can't remember which one it was, where the repayment, I think the write-off could be anything between 30% and 50%. I wasn't sure.
Oh, that's the share of individuals with some debt written off. That's not quite the same thing. Yeah. Okay. I think I'm going to finish it there, but feel free to ask afterwards. Okay. Cheers.